Hello, my name is Anil Shrestha and I'm a professor in the plant science department at Fresno State. Here I am in the middle of a tomato field, and I was trying to make the point that farming is a very risky venture. Crops not only have to face abiotic challenges with the environment, temperature, those kinds of things, but they have to face major challenges with biotic organisms, those we call pests. And they can be insects, they can be diseases, they can be weeds, nematodes, bacteria, virus, or even vertebrate pests. So farmers have to protect their crops, and in the end, farming has to be profitable, and consumers want crops that don't have any blemishes in them, and they have to be very clean, free of diseases and any insect damage. So how do farmers keep their crops clean and marketable without using pest control methods is the question that I have. I'm standing here with a graduate student who's doing her thesis on tomatoes, and she's going to talk about the types of pest pressure she's had just in one season. And if you can imagine, just in a small plot, that she has so much pest pressure, how it would be in a big farm setting where farming has to be profitable. And again, as I said, the crop has to be clean and pest free. So I'm going to introduce the student here. Hannah, can you tell us who you are and what you're doing here?
Yes, so I'm Hannah Chamberlain. I'm, like Dr. Shrestha said, working in a tomato thesis project. And he had mentioned that pest pressures are a big part of farming. And even in just such a small plot, I've had significant pest pressures during this season, one of which I thought I would lose my entire crop. You can see that damage here, down in these plants, with the dead and necrotic foliage. We had an infestation of tomato russet mite, which is a microscopic mite insect, and we weren't able to figure out what it was until we were able to take a sample to a lab and actually look under a powerful microscope. To resolve that, we had to do a spray of sulfur, and although the plants look okay now, in earlier growth stages, like I had mentioned, I thought I was going to lose my entire crop. Other pest pressures that I've experienced have been vertebrates, specifically rabbits, which can occur in commercial fields as well. But another insect pest is actually leafhopper, causing curly top virus. And what that does in the plants is it infects like meristematic growth and essentially shuts down the growth of the plant. We don't see any of that damage here, but it is in patches throughout the field.
So as Hannah was saying, the pest pressure, even in a small plot like this, is there. So what do we do to protect the crop? And I also like to make the point that as the population grows, we have more mouths to feed in the world. So the question is, do we do it with pesticides or other options, or do we combine various options, which we call integrated pest management, which this video is about? Now, there was a recent report, I think since 1990, that report said that the use of pesticides actually has doubled in the last decade or so. So even with all kinds of pest control measures, we still have pests, and the pesticide use is actually increasing. So probably the time has come now to ask, what are the reasons that we have pests in the first place? So we have to understand the biology of the pest, the ecology of the pest, and options to control them, and not just rely on pesticides. So that's where integrated pest management comes in. So how do farmers keep their crops pest free? Now, I also want to make the point that plants can photosynthesize and make their own carbohydrates and energy. That's how they survive. But other organisms, many other organisms, don't have the ability to photosynthesize. So they depend on plants as a source of food, and that's why we have the so-called pests. Now, are pesticides the only option to protect the plants? Now, if you look at the history of pesticides, way back decades and decades ago, centuries ago, the Chinese used arsenic, and there are Roman stories from Rome where they used salts and ashes for crop protection. And in the 1940s, we had the development of synthetic pesticides. And since then, pesticides have become a very important component of farming systems. But are pesticides the only option for farming, protecting the crops from pests? That is where integrated pest management comes. According to a report that was published by the European Crop Protection Group a few years ago, the global yield loss due to diseases and pests would be about 40%. Now, it would be even more than that, almost double of that, if it was not for pesticides. And there was another report published recently called the Pesticide Atlas, which shows that in the last 10 years, since 1990 actually, the pesticide use has gone up by almost double globally. So are pesticides the only option? And this is again where IPM comes in. But I was also worried about what is the future going to look like. And to ask such questions, I approached Dr. Pete Goodell of the UCIPM program. He was the former associate director for the UCIPM program. So I asked him several questions which I will share in this video. Pest pressure, or I should say the use of pesticides, is increasing globally because of the increase in population. But the other thing is, people are moving away from farms, and this is like a global trend. People tend to go to industries. So there is a decline in the labor force in farming. Now, when there is a decline in labor force, they don't have the needed labor to, for example, even in the case of cotton in some of these developing countries, they had the labor to pick insects out of the cotton crop or pull weeds. Now they don't have the labor force, so they are now forced to use pesticides, and that probably is one of the reasons why we see an increase in global pesticide use. Now, if you do decide to use pesticides to manage pests, the safe and effective use of pesticides becomes very important, and it's very important to follow label directions and follow the protocols for protecting not only yourself as an applicator but also the environment surrounding you. Okay, so here I am with another graduate student here at Fresno State, and she's helping in these plots spraying pesticides. Now you may wonder, like what type of pesticide she's spraying, and I have a respirator with me. I'm just holding it so that she can speak. But can you tell us who you are and what you're doing in this plot?
Hi, how's it going? My name is Vianney Medina, and I am here at California State University, Fresno. I am here spraying these plots. I know I am using pesticides, but I am following PPE requirements such as obviously Tyvek, gloves, respirator. So just making sure that we are following the correct label directions.
So this is one of the major method of pest control, pesticides. Now pesticides can be synthetic, organic, or organically certified pesticides. So organic farming also uses pesticides. All the farming systems uses some subtype of pest control measures. But in integrated pest management, pesticide use is not ruled out. In fact, it is one of the components of pest management. Hi, I'm here with Dr. Peter Goodell, the former UCIPM advisor. He's an emeritus now with the University of California A&R system, and he has had a lot of experience with IPM over the years. So the person on the cover of this book is actually Dr. Peter Goodell years ago. The concept of IPM, or integrated pest management, was introduced decades ago, and people have been using these practices. But as I mentioned earlier, the use of pesticides still keep increasing. So I was curious, what is the future going to look like in terms of pests and the pest pressure? And I asked this question to Dr. Pete Goodell, the former UCIPM advisor, and this is what he had to say.
Predicting pest pressure into the future is a very difficult job, and one which I'm not sure anyone can do. However, you can see from large-scale issues that we face today, you could think that probably something like climate change will be affecting the variety and diversity and expansion of pests. It depends on whether or not another new invasive species occur, and when they occur, and how prepared we are for them when they come in. As the production changes, where a lot of more direct-to-consumer, smaller scale agriculture might be getting in, that's going to change the whole perspective of how that's going to be managed, who's going to be managing it, who's going to be doing field inspections, because now you have a lot of smaller fields out there. Cropping pattern. As your cropping pattern shifts, we may be going back from when I started, we had a lot of field crops, and by the time I retired 40 years later, we had a lot of tree crops. So the whole environment had changed, and how the movement of pests across that, particularly when you're speaking of insects. So if there is a move toward fewer permanent crops, then that's going to change that whole dynamic as well. And certainly one of the keys too is if fields are being abandoned for whatever reason, then we have a lot of nuisance pests that might be out there, and we have to manage that as well. So I think it's going to be a combination of really the change of environment, including retirement of acreage to solar farms, more urbanization might increase or decrease, change in cropping might increase or decrease. It all kind of depends on the kinds of crops and pests that might be out there. I can't predict whether there's going to be an increase or not, and it's a lot of different variables. One is what happens to the pest management pressure or the pest pressure that comes on. Does it increase, decrease? The other is what products that might be available to manage that problem in terms of the cost of the input. I think what matters is being able to look at a particular field for whatever production practices you're looking at, be it for insects or diseases or weeds or whatever, and have the best ability, have as much information available to say, this is the way we could go. And part of that decision might be, I have to use a particular pesticide right now. Now the choice of that pesticide depends upon, what your pressure is, how well it works, what restrictions might be applied to it, et cetera, et cetera. So more or less use of pesticides is going to be determined by the amount of pest pressure that might be there, and the other techniques and methods you have to manage it before you get to that point. I just want to iterate as I go through this conversation with you and your students, is that, pesticides should be the product of last resort, that we're working with a system and we want to be able to manage that system as best we can. And when we need a pesticide, we can put it on and take care of the problem as much as possible without causing a lot of disruption to the environment, to the people, and to the economy.
Although we use pesticides in an IPM system, the state regulations, the California state regulations, is very stringent in pesticide use. So we have the pesticide use reporting system, which is one of its kind in the world and probably one of the best systems in the world. Having said that, the California Department of Food and Agriculture and the Department of Pesticide Regulations wants to go beyond IPM, and they have recently introduced another term called sustainable pest management, in which IPM is a part of the whole process. So for this, how sustainable pest management is defined and what his opinion is about sustainable pest management, I reached out to Dr. Pete Goodell, a former UCIPM advisor, to give us some comments on the sustainable pest management program. And here's what he had to say.
With the definition of IPM starting back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, in fact, was first used by Richard Nixon, actually, where many things have changed. You know, when we talk about, or when I talk about integrated pest management, that is the part of the field or the part of the practices of the entire agronomic system that tries to manage that pest and prevent as much injury as possible. Since then, we've moved in toward, and of course with that, we've now integrated it into the overall agronomic practices, the irrigation, the fertilization, the choice of cultivars that you might be using. So that expands it just from the bug or from the disease all the way now to beginning into the system. I've worked for years with what are the surrounding crops doing to help or hinder the development of pest pressure. More recently, in the last 15 years, the human side of that has come in. The impact of pesticide use or even pest management practices per se on the workers, on the consumers, on the surrounding folks who live in the area. That's become a major pillar of the sustainable pest management program. So it goes from, we tried to integrate it across pest disciplines, across management techniques, and now we're moving it stepped up to including the environment and society. The problem that they're going to have, in my opinion, is that without the research on new pests, on existing pests, on the existing pests that your controls now are more limited, or the changing environment, we need more research to understand what the development of these pest populations, be they disease or be they weeds or insects or nematodes, how do we manage them in a way that we have some science-based information on that? And how do we get those practices into the hands of those who need them? And by the practices, I mean not just the science of this is what happens to the crop and the pest, but what can we use those practices in a way that an IPM practitioner can use them? How can we? I've always said that there was kind of the pure research, the applied research where we try to find answers. I have always thought I worked at the level of adaptive research. So I take things from the campus and we worked with it to make it available to the practitioner in a way that fits within their particular business model, they and the grower. Yeah. So as it's gotten more holistic, larger and larger in its context of how we manage pests with the environment and society in mind, I want to make sure everybody goes back to an understanding that we're still working with the pest and the crop, and how do we manage that. The what happens after that becomes sort of a larger issue, if you will. It's an issue with the crop protection companies. It's an issue with the regulators out in the environment. But when it comes down to it, I would be developing a program to this day is what's the interaction between pest and crop, and what do we do to minimize that impact on the surrounding environment. But it's always back, and I think when we talk about integrated pest management, is still there as a major component, and we have these continuing concentric circles building around that in terms of societal concerns.
The principles of IPM state that there are certain steps in an IPM program. First, you got to identify the pest. For example, if this is a weed, what type of weed it is. Same thing if it's an insect, what type of insect it is. Then you also got to decide what is your acceptable level of damage from these pests, and then you got to decide on the threshold, the economic threshold, and I will get to explaining thresholds later. Then you got to decide what are your options for controlling this pest, and then you implement the pesticide management program or the pest management program if you're using something else other than a pesticide. And after that, you got to evaluate the effectiveness of the management method. So for that, you got to monitor the fields, evaluate the effects. So monitoring, evaluation, all of these things become very important. And then then you have a whole IPM program in place.
In implementing an integrated pest management program, the first and one of the most important steps is to properly identify the pest. With proper identification of the pest, you know something about the pest biology and have greater confidence that your pest management tactics are actually targeting the right organism. Once we have properly identified the pest, then we can learn something about the pest biology so that we can target the most susceptible life cycle stages of the pest for our management.
So what are you doing here, Jennifer? First, introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Jennifer, and I'm a graduate student here at California Federal State University. And what I'm doing is a method called sweeping. This method is an IPM practice which helps us monitor insect pressures, identify insects, and also it allows us to evaluate if a type of insecticide or chemical application needs to be applied, or any other type of control methods.
Now, do you think this method is applicable only for those that use pesticides, or can be used in other ecological farming systems as well?
I think it could be used in any other ecological farming systems. It's a very great option, like I said, to monitor pests and identify the specific pests that you are seeing in your fields.
So the idea is to monitor and see if the pest pressure is high enough to take any intervention.
Correct, if it's ideal for any other method of control.
Thank you, Jennifer. As I had mentioned earlier about economic thresholds, it is that level where the potential loss from these pests exceeds the cost of control. But that's in a simplified way. There is more to it, and for this again I asked Dr. Goodell on how he approaches economic thresholds.
One of the things that I have worked on through the years is I don't really use the concept of economic threshold. I use an action threshold. Economic thresholds are built on what the value of the crop is, when the loss occurs, I'm sure you've got a graph that shows a lot of that. I look at it from the standpoint the grower has to make a decision within a certain amount of time. And sometimes your population might be lower than what causes damage just because it takes you a week to get an application out there if you need to spray. The other thing is, as our products change, a lot of our economic thresholds were developed years ago, 70s, 80s, even 90s, where we had, and I'm talking mostly about insects, where we had really good knockdown products. So it reaches the point, you spray it, it goes down. A lot of our products now are much more like plant disease management. You can't wait for the disease to get into a full-blown stage. You need to knock that inoculum down before that. So in many cases now we're managing the population over time. So you may be actually putting on an application earlier than you normally would have because you don't have that material they used to use to knock it down when the entomologists first started doing this. So I still think the economic threshold is a reasonable, some threshold is important to be able to know if you're at a point where you need to start thinking about treating. And I've often thought about a red, yellow, green kind of concept, that I go to the field behind me here and I'm looking for a particular insect or disease, or looking here and seeing what the weeds look like, and it's all green right now, nothing to worry about. I tell the grower, nothing to worry about this week. I'll be back next week. Well, next week I find a few. So we begin to go to yellow, which may have a dip. So you begin now maybe to go more in depth with a field. You take a little bit more time with it, you search it out. And when I was a pest control advisor, an IPM practitioner in the field back a long time ago, I always worried when I didn't get any numbers. Did that mean there were no numbers there, or I just missed them? So if a 0 comes up, I tend to take more time in the field to make sure there's nothing there. When you hit spots where there's lots of it, your decision is made as well. So inspecting the field, whichever sampling method you use, which is part of the development of that action or economic threshold, you have to have a way to sample. And for each individual organism, it may be something different. And one of the things I would encourage, I've worked with PCAs who have given me ideas on how to develop an economic threshold on certain plants, because that's how they did it in the field. They didn't have any really tight science with it, statistics or anything else. But what we did was we took his idea, then brought it to the field, replicated, and said, yes, that works. So a lot of times these things can come from the field, but then again, you probably need to have it in a little bit more tightly controlled environment to where you can actually see what the damage may or may not be. Then having a way to sample it is really critical, be it, again, weeds. When do you have too many weeds? And with weeds, you always have this problem of, well, how many, it's not really affecting the crop, but next year all the seeds come back. So you're dealing with a multi-year, multi-generation problem. With insects, you tend to be looking at what flies in that year and develops. Plant diseases could blow in, could remain in the soil, particularly if you have a soil-borne one. That's a multi-year issue, which again takes us to, there may not be a pesticide solution to that. It may be a cultural or a longer-term plan to rotate around it or whatever.
Now, IPM advocates the use of many different tools for pest management, and these include biological control, cultural control, mechanical control, chemical control, host plant resistance, behavioral control, and microbial control as well. But let me caution you that you should not rely continuously on one particular tool. The idea of IPM is to use these tools in conjunction with each other or in combinations. Otherwise, if you use the same tool over and over again, you'll get species that will adapt to that particular system and become dominant. So for this, we talked to Dr. Farrar of UCIPM to explain the concepts further.
When we're considering the integrated part of integrated pest management, it's important to think about using multiple tactics in order to manage the pest. This avoids unintended environmental and human health consequences and also has the lowest likelihood of leading to pest resistance. There are lots of different kinds of pest management tactics to consider. Host pest resistance is one of the easiest to implement, using resistant rootstocks for perennial crops that are grafted, or using resistant varieties for annual crops where we have appropriate resistance for that particular pest. Many of the host pest resistance tactics are appropriate for plant diseases and in some cases for insects. They don't work particularly well for a lot of other kinds of insects and probably not at all for weeds. Cultural control is another kind of tactic that we can consider. Changing the conditions that the plant is growing in, changing the row spacing, changing irrigation practices or nutrient management are various kinds of cultural management for pests. Biological control is another option, and one of the least expensive kinds of biological control is to just maintain the already existing biological control organisms that are in the environment. Another option is to use release tactics or inundative biological control, where we're releasing organisms that will target the pest. But that is typically more expensive and more difficult to do than conservation biological control. Another kind of tactic is mechanical control. Mechanical control is often used for weeds, but is also appropriate for other kinds of pests. And then we can also use microbial pest control. So microbial pest control is often used for plant diseases, but can also be used for some insect pests.
Now, often heard Dr. Peter Goodell talk about the need for IPM to be at a landscape level, and I wanted to know further what he meant by that, and I asked this question to him, and this is what he had to say about landscape level IPM.
In summary, it's the influence of the surrounding crops on your particular field. And so if there's a crop near you that provides the pest, what is the status of your crop as that one crop begins to get harvested, and all the bugs have to go somewhere. It may also be diseases that, I think a good example of that is processing tomato, that you have different times of harvest. You can't harvest them all at the same time. So if you have late tomatoes, you generally get all the bugs that were in the area into your fields. They've had several months now to go through several generations, and then they find your tomato field, and that's where they want to go. So canning tomatoes might be easier in the June-July period than it is in the August-September period. So if you're surrounded by canning tomatoes and you have the last canning tomato field there, you're going to get everything coming to your field because that's what they have to do to survive. The real catch on doing landscape management is we can do the science and kind of find out which crop acts as a particular site for a particular pest. And we did that with lygus bug on cotton. And one of the things that we really noticed changed was that cotton acreage shrank and other crops took its place. If those crops that took its place weren't a lygus host, your problem actually goes down. But if you have a lot of cotton around you and you're in the middle of that cotton field, in the middle of that big patch of cotton with your one field, if you can get your neighbors to work together and manage so the pest doesn't come, then you're well on your way. So what we found was we had suggestions for management, but it takes a community. So it becomes less of a science problem and more of a social problem. How do you get a community to work together? Why would they want to work together? And that generally happens when everybody's pretty much affected. But when only part of the community is affected, then it gets a little harder for everybody to say, well, why should I, make sure my crop is disc down, or why should I make sure that I rotate out when I should? Why should I not plant a bunch of this that affects your crop? So it becomes really a community problem, and a problem that the community has to address. I think the understanding's there, and I think the science is there. But if the community doesn't want to work this way, and I think that, my opinion, that only happens when it's an absolute pending disaster. Then people finally say, what do we got to do to work together?
Well, in my opinion, I think IPM is more important in vegetable cropping systems than in agronomic or other types of cropping systems. The reason I say this is because the agronomic crops and the other types of fruit crops, etc., go through a lot of processing before it reaches the consumer. Whereas in the case of vegetables, we sometimes consume it the day that we harvest it. In other words, it doesn't need to go through a lot of processing as the other crops. So there are two concepts that become very important if you're using pesticides in vegetable cropping systems. One is the pre-harvest interval, and the second is the maximum residue limit. Now, what does pre-harvest interval mean? It is the amount of time that has to lapse before you can safely harvest that crop and consume it. So that's the pre-harvest interval. The second one is the maximum residue limit. That is the legal limit of how much pesticide residue is allowed in the produce before it can be marketed. So those are two important concepts, and these tie in with the issue of food safety. And to elaborate on food safety further, we asked Dr. Jim Farrar from the UCIPM to talk about this.
In considering integrated pest management and food safety, there are a couple different areas to talk about. The first is food safety in terms of pesticide residue. Because of EPA registration standards and the very intensive sampling that USDA and Department of Pesticide Regulation do for pesticide residues every year, we can have great confidence that any pesticide residue found on fresh produce is very, very low risk. So that the food benefits of a healthy and nutritious diet filled with fruits and vegetables far, far outweighs any risk from pesticide residue on produce. The second aspect of food safety to consider is the possibility that microbial agents which are problematic for human health can get into or onto food. So bacterial or fungal problems can occur on food. This often happens when the food product has been damaged in some way by another pest, allowing in either bacterial contaminants or fungi that can grow and produce mycotoxins, which are fungal-produced toxins which in very low concentrations can have huge human health and animal health impacts. Finally, in considering what kind of advice I would give to someone who's going to become an IPM practitioner, I would say learn the pests, all of the different kinds of pests that can be in your cropping system. Learn something about the cropping system. So how can you appropriately fertilize, irrigate, prune the crop for maintaining plant health. And then as we move into an area of higher and higher technology in integrated pest management, knowing something about monitoring systems, whether that's remote sensing or drones, but taking advantage of a lot of the new technology for pest monitoring, which will be very, very helpful in reducing some of the intensive labor that's associated with walking fields and doing the appropriate sampling and monitoring to make sure that we're keeping the pest populations low enough that we can produce an economically viable crop. So integrated pest management, the integrated is very important. The identification of the pest is very important, and considering the different management options is very important. And putting that all together is really the art and the science of being an IPM practitioner.
Hello, my name is Jennifer. I am a graduate student at California Fresno State University with the Neo-Shrestha. Question I have for you today, P, is finally, do you have any words of advice for students and practitioners of IPM in California?
I would say there's lots of words I could give as advice, but I would say primarily as a practitioner, where you're looking at a crop, it includes all of the pests that might be there. So you have to be familiar with the pests. You have to be familiar with the practices, because if you make a recommendation that is going to interfere with another production practice, say irrigation, where you can't get into the field, you have to adjust your decisions according to that. I would say it's building trust with your clients, to where your advice is taken in and you are truly consulted as to what best approach could be made. And be patient, because a lot of the decisions are made are immediate. We have a problem, we need it today. I think one of the things I learned over my career was, why do you have the same problem year after year after year? Maybe it's a problem of your system. So I would say always try to think big, look around, be aware of your situational awareness of all your crops, and just be persistent and be honest, and do the best you can with what you have. And as things change in the future, that's going to be for you to be flexible and adjust to that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.